So this panel is called Shaping New Priorities for Youth Justice. And as a description in your chat room shows, that the idea is the main question we're trying to answer here is whether the energy and the anger generated by the George Floyd killing has helped shape or change in any way the priorities for youth justice. And that's just not just during the pandemic, but afterwards. And we've got two excellent speakers who Marcy will be moderating: Steve Bishop, who is a senior associate for the Annie Casey Foundation, and David Mohammed, who's the executive director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. And as soon as they come on screen, Marcy will introduce them. This will be an hour. There's Steve. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
And we'll hopefully we'll have enough time for questions and answers as well. So, Marcy, I'll over to you for the start.
Yep, I don't. Steve, I'm sorry, I'm not sure. We had the wrong Zoom link sent to us, so I've tried to send it to the other two panelists who'll be joining us. So I'll start with me and Steve, and then we can take it from there if that's okay.
I can send a link as well again to David if he doesn't have it. Shall I do that?
That would be great.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about the technical difficulties to get started today. I hope you guys are having a great Friday afternoon. I will be actually joined by three folks today. Steve is here. Steve Bishop is here with me from the Annie Casey Foundation, and then we'll also be joined by David Mohammed, who joins us, who's going to be joining us from California, as well as from Devontae Springer, who will also be on from California. We are here to talk about race and juvenile justice and the media, and really want this to be an interactive conversation. So hoping that we can keep our comments kind of brief and then engage discussions from you. I want to just give a quick overview in terms of the past 15 years and what has happened in the youth justice space. We have seen a huge drop in the number of arrests, detention, numbers of young people in the system. And there's been a lot of work around alternatives to detention, removing children from the adult criminal justice system, and other ways to get children who are engaged in status offenses or other non-criminal behavior out of the deepest end of the system. So just to give you an idea, juvenile arrests are down from 2 million a year to about 728,000 a year as of last year. That is only 7% of all arrests in the United States. The rate of any sort of serious crime, and I think this is something that really is important for us to talk about today, and I think Steve and David will really touch on this and drive this home, is that young people really are not the drivers of any sort of serious and or violent crime. I think there's a huge misperception in media, largely driven by media, to that effect. And as a matter of fact, last year, the rate of serious or violent crime was only 8.6 out of every 100,000 young people. And that's, to give you an idea, that's down from 52 for every 100,000 kids in the mid-1990s. Our out-of-home placement, while having been dropped 65% over the past 15 or 20 years, still leads internationally. We still incarcerate way too many children, down to about 37,000 children every night sleep outside of their homes and out-of-home placements through the juvenile justice system. And then because I work at the Campaign for Youth Justice, which is a national campaign focused on getting children out of the adult criminal justice system, I also want to point out that we have reduced the number of young people that are charged as adults by 70%. So the fact that we've been pushing the entire system down from the deepest end, from kids in the adult system down, and our arrests are continuing to fall, and young people are engaging in violence at the lowest rate in over 50 years, brings us to a really, really critical point today about race. Because if you look at the tension points across every single touch point, the racial and ethnic disparities of young people who have touched the system has not budged, despite all of that celebratory decreases that I just went over. If anything, they have increased in terms of the number of young people are still in out-of-home placements, and the number of kids in the adult system. The racial disparities have actually worsened. So I use that today as kind of an overall context, because I think what we're going to talk about is another really big point on the juvenile justice system that doesn't get near enough attention from media, which is that of probation and diversion. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who's going to tell us a little bit about his work and get to some of that context. So Steve, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Steve Bishop, Senior Associate in the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I manage what we call our probation transformation work. So I think that's where I'll start in terms of some of my comments related to this topic around race and juvenile justice. I think the overview Marcy gave was spot on in terms of, yes, we can celebrate a lot of reductions, but we can see that the disparities are as great, if not greater, than they were 15, 20 years ago. So lots of things to still be concerned about. And in my estimation, the work that I lead, probation is really at the center of that, largely because probation, quite frankly, plays an outsized role in the juvenile justice system. Each year, on average, about 2/3 of all young people who are adjudicated in juvenile courts go on probation. But it's important to also know that that's just on the adjudicated side. There's actually almost as many young people in the last year of data who are on probation caseloads who have not been adjudicated. So they fall below that threshold and are on like informal probation caseloads and things of that sort who are on probation. So probation has this really outsized role, and it particularly has an impact on youth of color. Because we see disparities in terms of arrests with youth of color and then who gets referred to the juvenile justice system. We know that youth of color actually are underrepresented and get fewer opportunities at diversion than their white peers. I think the latest year of data was about 48% of cases of white youth were diverted versus about 37% for Black youth. And just to really put that in context, the latest year of data shows us that a white youth is more likely to get diverted if they have a person offense than a Black youth who has a public order offense. So some really striking disparities in terms of the decisions that that practitioners are making when kids come to the front door. And then actually when they get on probation, see pretty striking disparities as well. Youth of color are overrepresented compared to the representation in general population on probation. But then probation continues to be a feeder to incarceration and institutional placement as well. So overall, about 1 in 5 placements are for breaking rules, either technical violations of probation or failing to comply with like orders related to status offenses. So we know probation continues to be a feeder. And then within that, almost 2/3 of all the kids who end up incarcerated for technical violations of probation are youth of color. So we see more youth of color going into the probation system. It continues to be a feeder and a trajectory to out-of-home placement, and it most strikingly impacts kids of color there. Trying to think if there were other. I think that's pretty much the overview I would give there. One thing I would say related to this in term for this discussion is, probation's really kind of gotten a pass, and I think that's kind of the biggest concern is that most focus on juvenile justice reform has been on facilities, and rightfully so, because we know a lot of harm is done to young people in facilities. But probation's really gotten a pass. And I think most in the general public tend to assume that probation, particularly juvenile probation, is fairly benign and harmless. Much more attention has been given the last couple of years on the adult side, and knowing, just the huge probation caseloads on the adult side. And while they are smaller on the juvenile side, again, it's a pretty significant footprint, and we should really pay attention to that. and not take for granted what the nature of that experience is for kids and families, particularly youth of color. And so, I mean, because it's based largely off an adult model that's broken, and then you kind of double down when you factor in that it's not really designed to think about the unique needs of teenagers, particularly kids of color. So that becomes really a troubling point as well in terms of not recognizing, most may think juvenile probation officer and think of someone that's a mentor, a counselor, and something along those lines, like a counselor. But the reality is, you look across the country at juvenile probation officers, they look like adult probation officers, they look like cops. Many of them wearing utility belts and bulletproof vests and firearms and all the looks and feel of adult probation. And these are people who are visiting kids at home, going into the schools, going into various community organizations where these young people may be engaged in activities. So very much all the look and feel of the traditional punitive approaches to probation that I think we've come to appreciate are negative on the adult side, but understanding those harms also on the side for juveniles. And the last point I'd just make is related to this with how many young people, particularly youth of color, end up on probation, is also understanding some of the barriers that kids of color face in general. We know from lots of research and data now that kids of color, particularly Black boys, are viewed to be much older, 4 to 5 years older than their actual age, bigger than their actual physical size, perceived as being more prone to criminality. So I think that those types of biases that we know exist across the spectrum in our society really bleed into juvenile justice decision making. And that really kind of leads to some of the earlier points I talked about, where youth of color just get fewer opportunities to be diverted from the system altogether, get pulled into the system, and then any of the rule breaking that may occur on probation really gets criminalized and leads to deeper in the system. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Mark. No, you're on mute, Marcy.
Thanks, Steve. I said you put things in really, really critical context there, and there is a question as to whether you could kind of repeat those numbers again when it comes to the diversion programs. Repeat it a little bit slower in terms of, because somebody was asking, they didn't quite get it.
Okay, yeah, sure. So what I was remarking is that I believe it's about 48% of all cases for white youth are diverted. That's compared to about 37% for Black youth. That white youth are actually more likely to be diverted for a person offense than a Black youth to be diverted for a public order offense.
Great, thank you. And then there was one other question here about whether you could talk about the connection between public school security, police, and how that feeds into the juvenile justice system, particularly with young people of color. And if,
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we know from decades of research now that by far and large, adolescents, kids get involved in the same type of behaviors regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic background, culture. They largely engage in the same activities. So the young person coming to the attention of the juvenile justice system hinges as much, if not more, on the neighborhood they live in, the school that they attend, if that school has school resource officers, than their actual behavior. So there's definitely a interconnectedness there. And we all know about, prison to prison pipeline, and that really shows up for youth of color when you have schools that have school resource officers. They may have school-based probation officers, which even further exacerbates the situation. And again, going back to that point about the barriers of kids of color and how they're perceived, be older, to be bigger, more prone to criminality. That infects the decision making not only of juvenile justice practitioners, but I would say probably educators and other folks in the human services field who tend to use the juvenile justice system kind of as its default and kind of the safety net for any of their problems that they haven't been successful solving and working with youth of color. So oftentimes, family crisis, substance abuse, mental health issues, school behavioral issues, all those things end up becoming criminalized and end up in referrals to the juvenile justice system. And then, as I detailed, the sector just kind of goes on from there. The boss.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to take a break in the questions for 1 second here because David's joined us. And David, if you could just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the work you do in context to juvenile justice and the issue of racism.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Mohammed. I am the Executive Director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, and I spent about a decade I used to always say on the dark side of the force. I did a training for POs the other day, and they didn't appreciate my characterization of my time in the system that way. And so, but I spent about 10 years as a correctional administrator and in DC, New York, and Oakland. And for the last 10 years, have been working with systems around technical assistance and trainings and policy development. And I think the big point in terms, especially in terms of the media, obviously my experience is when there's a crisis of some sort, that's when the media is interested in probation. You know, my time in Washington, D.C. was quite interesting because never been to a place since that had such kind of sensational coverage of the juvenile justice system. You know, anytime we had anything going on in a facility, there was some interesting reasons for that, but the contrast was interesting. And before becoming the chief probation officer in Alameda County, where Oakland is, I was back home where I'm from there visiting, and there was an escape of 2 young people who were inside the facility for some pretty serious charges, and there was zero coverage whatsoever from the media versus in DC, if we had an attempted abscondence, it would be crazy media. I start that way just to say, obviously here we're talking about better, more informed coverage, and because facilities are a bit more sexy and interesting to cover, and mass incarceration and what happens in facilities and abuse of children and all those other things are understandably, but to understand the system, probation, in the community supervision is by far the largest aspect of the justice system, right? So there are far, far, far more young people in the justice system who are at home under the supervision of a probation department than there are in any other aspect of the system. And so in terms of understanding the juvenile justice system, it's very important to understand that. The other part about that is probation is a significant driver of incarceration. So young people who have been sent to probation, which was originally designed as a diversion. It's interesting timing. I'll try not to be all over the place, but I just got off of a call with the chief probation officer of Cook County, which of course Cook County is the birthplace of the juvenile justice system. And he was talking about how they're sometimes still seen because they're a rare agency in the country where the probation department doesn't also run the juvenile detention center. And so a different agency runs the juvenile detention center. And so they're seen somewhat as the old school, their alternatives to probation. But even that agency has historically been a driver to incarceration. They've done better, largely because they've worked for a long time with Stephen's organization, the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. But there's still hardline POs who think that young people should be held accountable through incarceration. A couple of just other points I just want to say is there are a few good examples. Ironically, as much as I think the Bay Area in California's media market is pretty terrible, to be honest, I think that there's been a couple of very good examples to come out of that market. One has been the series called Vanishing Violence from the San Francisco Chronicle, where they intended to do a deep dive on violence among young people and found that it had plummeted, and they really pivoted to do a series on juvenile justice, which also talked about reduced incarceration rates and skyrocketing costs to the tune of $500,000 per youth per year to be in a juvenile detention center in some Bay Area counties. And so those are, I think, it was a really well done series. Ironically, also in San Francisco was a television news segment, which really captured risk assessments well. That was unbelievably surprising. A, that a news agency would capture juvenile risk assessments well. B, it was done by a nightly news agency. And it was just clearly a reporter who decided to really understand the issue and report it in a way where the average community member can. The last two parts I'll say is on this issue. Obviously, the justice system is extraordinarily disproportionate. And as the system has significantly reduced, it has actually become more disproportionate. And I don't know if Steve covered this earlier, but the recent reports are showing the good thing is that there are about 60% less youth incarcerated today than there were about 10 or 15 years ago, which is victory. We should take that victory. Yes, we want to do more, but the disproportionality is worse. Right. And so this is a challenge that as we reduce the system, the percentage of people of color, especially Black children, are a higher percentage of those young people who are incarcerated. And to understand those issues are most critical. Last point I'll say is as we're thinking about this, for instance, in Oakland, we're considering how we announce this program that we've been running for about 8 months, and we've deliberately done it under the radar so that we can grow it and it can be successful. But we believe that we're at that point. About 30 young people in the last 8 months who've been diverted at the point of arrest for felonies by the police department, who are on site of arrest diverted to a community-based diversion program. So they never touch probation, they never touch juvenile detention, they never touch DA, they never touch the court system. They're diverted by the police department at the point of arrest to a pretty extraordinary diversion program where a group of community members, business owners, clergy, formerly incarcerated individuals, former victims of crime, serve as a kind of village council, taking justice back to the old days of town councils, village councils, council of elders, and they sit with the young people. It's sitting virtually now, and determine what the young person's kind of plan is going to be, with incarceration not being an option. And most of that is connecting them to a network of community-based services that we are tied to. And it has been exceptionally successful, right? So it's only 8 months, it's early on, 30 young people, not one rearrested. Again, we want to be able to say that 3 years from now, and with 300 youth. But it is the details of that in terms of the diversion and how it's going and how it's run are somewhat complicated, right? And so being able to explain that to media and to the public through media could be a challenge. I'll drop a link to that program in the chat, but I'm really using it as an example of the type of challenges we have in explaining juvenile justice reform.
Myself, I'm sorry. There actually is a question here that gets to your point that this is complicated a little bit, but can you explain kind of the difference between probation as an alternative to incarceration, and then some of these programs that you're talking about where they're actually diverted, so they kind of that difference between a diversion program that doesn't even touch probation and then probation as an alternative to incarceration?
Yeah, so good question, and it brings up the complication. So probation was created on the adult side, but it was created first in Boston. John Augustus, as it was a shoe cobbler, and went to court and said, "Judge, don't send this person to jail. Let him, let me work with him. Let him be an apprentice under me." And it worked. The person did well, and no good deed goes unpunished. And so the judge kept calling John Augustus back to court and kept giving him people to work with. And that turned into first probation. In fact, in Massachusetts, the first probation laws are called the John Augustus laws. And it was designed as this diversion. And the juvenile side of it flowed from there later in 1999 in Cook County, Illinois. And so, 1899. And so the idea is, and legally this is still the case everywhere, right? Probation is voluntary. Now, you know, ask somebody on probation if it's voluntary. But the idea is that instead of getting some sort of sentence or going to juvenile detention or to some sort of juvenile institution or placement, you're being placed on probation. And so it is, you're under supervision of a probation officer. The reality is most often it's both. You're sitting in detention for some period of time, then you get out and placed on probation. And if you violate any terms of those probation, technical terms like not showing up to a meeting with the PO or not finishing a mentoring program, you can be violated and reincarcerated. Whereas a diversion program skips that. So in the instance of this Neighborhood Opportunity and Accountability Board, the referral goes directly to the community-based agency. It never goes to, so in California, the way the process goes is police arrest you, you're taken to probation either for detention or for a notice to appear, which means they'll calendar a court date for you. Then the DA goes forward with charging, and then you have a court date. This diversion program is right when you're arrested, you are given a notice that you're going to be allowed to be diverted to a diversion program, and you never see probation or DA or court, versus the type of diversion that is thought of in probation is you get locked up, you go to court, then the judge determines your sentence, and your sentence might be, instead of some sort of custody, you're going to go home with a law enforcement probation. Many probation officers around the country have guns and badges, and that's your diversion. Community diversion obviously is extremely different.
Thanks, David. I'm gonna ask you guys a question in terms of what is a narrative shift that you'd like to see the media cover when it comes to young people on probation?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think part of it is that I started with, which is that it's not this benign experience. It's not, they're not counselors, they're not mentors. It remains to be seen if probation can transform itself into that. And I mean, the work that I lead at the Casey Foundation, that's what we're trying to promote, is greater use of diversion and true diversion in the way that David described it, you know, directly to community-based organizations, but also for probation for young people who may be at higher risk to reoffend, have a higher level of needs, and require additional support and guidance, that probation be focused on just that, providing support and assistance and opportunities to young people. And so understanding and challenging probation, juvenile probation, taking a critical look at its makeup. And so I would say for, you know, those listening, you know, even within your local communities, getting a better feel for probation and not making the assumption again that it's like counselors and mentors and benign, but are they carrying firearms? Do they wear bulletproof vests? Are they in the schools? And, you know, where that can greatly stigmatize young people. Do the probation officers have arrest powers? And that you can find in many of your state statutes that, you know, codify probation officers as peace officers or law enforcement officers. All of those things, in my mind, interfere with having a clear picture of what juvenile probation officers and their role should. So even if you have someone who's well-intentioned that wants to be more of a mentoring counselor, is not oriented towards law enforcement, if state statute says you're a peace officer and if local policy says you carry a firearm, then that is how the job is going to look and function. And ancillary to that is understanding when you have probation officers who carry firearms or bulletproof vests, there's a expense. So that's money spent one place that's not spent somewhere else. And it's a huge use of time and resources. There's a lot of time and training that has to go into being certified to carry firearms and all these different defense tactics, methods. And that's time, that time training there is time not being spent trained on skill development and motivational interviewing and building relationships and engaging families and communities. And so I think that would be one thing, is just not accept that and the assumption that juvenile probation is harmless and or to accept that it's necessarily helpful.
Thanks, Steve.
And
David,
just had a quick.
Yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that was beautifully set up. That allows me to pivot a little bit to additional, and so I think that that's the right thing in terms of probation and juvenile justice. The connected to this subject in terms of better lens, if you will, is the thing that I've seen not understood well at all in many cities is the reality that gun violence, young people's involvement in gun violence is extraordinarily small. And if you ask people what they think, what percentage of people who are involved in shootings are teenagers, if you ask the general public, they would give you something like 100 times the truth, probably, right? And largely that's because of news coverage. Now, part of it is when a young person's involved, shot or arrested for shooting, it does, it takes a lot of media, rightfully or wrongfully, and so it's embedded in people's minds. But most cities, and I've actually literally done these studies in terms of gun violence, most big cities, teenagers or people under the age of 18 are about 6-7% of people arrested for shootings. Like, it's an extremely small number. And that's pretty consistent around the country. You would never think that if you ask people or if you looked at coverage. And so I think better understand, because then that false perception fuels, well, they've got to be in the system, right? When you realize there's an extremely small number of young people involved in the most serious of crime.
Thanks for that, David. I'm going to ask you guys to answer some questions that are coming in through the chat and kind of take us off our pre-planned pieces. So if you want to weave your comments into those, please feel free to do so. But do one of you want to take this question? What impact do probation fees have on youth? And David, I know California just got rid of this. So maybe you can start with that answer, and then Steve can add to it from a national perspective.
I want to say a quick story. I'm going to try it very quick. I was, from Oakland and did advocacy and direct service work for years, and then I went to DC and New York to work in the system. When I came home to work in the system, DC and New York really worked on the adult system in New York. In DC, we didn't do fines and fees for our part of the system, and so. Point being, I came back to California, hadn't had that on my mind as a leading thing in terms of reform. A local advocacy group set up a meeting with me to meet with parents because I was coming in to reform the system. That's the only reason I worked in the system, and I had all these other reforms in mind, right, that I was going to delight them with, and they hit me solely with fines and fees. I was so unprepared, so taken aback. I was like, these are the hits I need to take when I work in the system, and it was embarrassing, quite honest, for me. Because that was what was hitting. We were, for the great joys of supervising your young person or locking your young person up, we're charging these parents for that, and it was just horrible way in which the system was behaving. Thankfully, Alameda County, San Francisco, a few other counties eliminated juvenile fines and fees, and then more recently, the entire state did. But what happens is you get charged a certain daily rate for being in detention, you get charged for the joy of being on supervision, you get charged for certain reports the probation department writes, and that's sent for youth, that's sent to their parents who are mostly already struggling financially, some who are mired in poverty, and then you're going to weigh them down further with a financial burden that often turns into collections and may hold young people from getting off probation until parents pay those fines and fees. It's really one of the worst parts of the system, the unseen parts of the system.
Thanks, David. And then Steve, I'm going to ask you a two-part question, if you're okay. One is, there was a question about how an arresting officer determines that the child goes directly into a diversion program. So that's kind of part A. And then part B of that is, where does the victim come from in a diversion process? Are they part of the community council? Oh, David, that part will go to you because they were specifically asking about your 8-month program. I'm sorry. So if you can take the first part, Steve, and David take the second part, please.
Sure. Yeah. So the best ways I've seen this done are just establishing really clear and consistent criteria for who should be diverted. So, for instance, what Los Angeles County is under, which is for all misdemeanors, most felonies, all nonviolent felonies. That criteria is pretty clearly established that those cases should be directly referred to a community-based organization. And then part of this, I would say, that's behind it, and kind of tying this to the earlier point I made about the role of probation officers, if they're peace officers, and all the equipment that they carry. And I'm only saying that to underscore the resources, because what we need juvenile courts and our justice system to do better with is adequately resourcing the community-based organizations that these young people and families will work with. So, and it's something ideal is having clear criteria so that that referral goes to community-based organization. They're well equipped to do the type of assessments and provide the types of interventions that a lot of cases juvenile probation departments have been doing. Obviously doing it in a non-punitive setting where you don't have the threat of incarceration looming over your head. Another example I'll just give is in Philadelphia. They had a school police diversion program, and they were able to reduce school-based arrests by over 60% over like a 3-4 year period. And that's largely because they established really clear, consistent criteria that except unless it was a serious violent offense in the school, that school-based offenses would not go to the police anymore, but they would be redirected to the county's human services department, where they could follow up, do an assessment with the young person and family, and help point them towards, voluntarily point them towards the types of support services that they might need.
And on the council, so part of the NOAA program does have a restorative justice component. And so one of our partners is an organization called Our Joy Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And they provide the restorative justice circles when you have a victim in an offense and you have a willing victim. And so in our instance, we've had a couple of those. We've had, they're almost all victim crimes. We've had a lot of victims say, I'm actually fine, because when there's a victim crime, the police department requires the victim to approve the diversion. And we've had victims say, I'm fine with the diversion. I don't want to participate as long as I know the young person's getting something meaningful. In other cases, there is a restorative justice component, so that the victim, the young person, and their family would sit in circle with a trained facilitator to talk about that. And of course, a lot of research that shows that is a more impactful and effective approach than the formal system. A lot of information about how victims are re-victimized by the formal process of the system that doesn't really take their interests in mind. So the restorative justice process, which is a piece of this NOAB part, this diversion program, is how victims play a role.
Thank you both. And then I just want to get to this really important question about ICE, because I think that the fact that there's a confluence of many systems in a lot of the kids' lives that we are trying to intervene with in a constructive way, this really underscores how many different systems kids can run into once they get one point of contact with law enforcement. But the question is, what kind of relationship do probation officers have with ICE? Do they regularly share information of ICE, or does it depend on a state's sanctuary laws? Is this something you're concerned about?
I'll start with that, and maybe you can jump in. I would say, at least my perspective, is that it's probably jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and may not have as much to do with like sanctuary laws as much as just the leaning of that individual juvenile court, the chief juvenile probation officer, and how they do their work. So for instance, the department that I first worked in, We worked really closely with police. We did ride-alongs with police. So it had more of a law enforcement leaning. And so if there would be a request from ICE, I'm sure that request would be met. In other jurisdictions that may position themselves more social workers, that don't have regular interaction, they don't have arrest powers, they're not out serving warrants and things of that nature, then that may not even come up on their radar to have that type of interaction. So really, I think one of the things that really underscores is just the importance of organizational culture and making that really sharp if needed within organizational culture in juvenile probation departments. Because if they see themselves, again, as law enforcement, then that's the way they're going to portray themselves. That's where their close partnerships are going to lie, as opposed to close partnerships types of service agencies that better outcomes.
And Steve, I think you really drove home a really significant point there that I think folks on this call need to understand. The juvenile justice system is extremely, extremely localized. So there is very little, there's maybe standards of practice, but in general, the local court has a lot of autonomy to make a lot of these decisions. And with probation in particular, I think you see that variance, as both Steve and David has talked a lot about today. I am a trained social worker and actually recently did a webinar on whether social workers could actually be effective probation officers, or if those two things can coexist. Can you have a social work frame that respects a young person and their experience in their environment when you are sitting in an office that has a law enforcement role? So I think it's a very interesting question that has yet to be tackled with. And I think ICE just adds a whole other level of fear tactic. And to both Steve and David's point, to the role of surveillance and oversight in young people's life versus really getting them back on a correct path.
Yeah, and I would just say it's funny that timing that I just had this call with the chief in Cook County, and we were talking about what he has now and what I had when I worked in the system, which is this schizophrenia of wanting to hire the best POs who would be the best by the young people and their families, while I also worked to help try to get young people to never be in the system, right? Because you're best served by the community, in the community, but that, you know, if you do come to the system, I want you to have the best person. But this is the struggle. And he was saying how, you know, he knows really good people who do bad things because they're in the bad system, right? And it just makes it hard for you to be like a social worker, where if you don't listen to the social worker, you're going to get locked up. Right. So when you have the threat of incarceration behind your, you know, your good stuff that you're trying to do with young people, it just really messes up. I mean, one thing I'll say, there was a county, it's so atrocious, I won't name it. I was working with who I had heard about their great reforms, which on paper sounded great. And I think parts of it really were great, which everybody under supervision was going to get functional family therapy, right? And so instead of getting surveillance and this traditional trail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em type of thing, that one, they did not supervise youth who were assessed low risk, and they owned your time on probation was functional family therapy, but they trained their POs to conduct the therapy, not licensed therapists. But the administration, who was pretty good, had a fight with the union and lost. And so the rules to POs doing the therapy in the house was the POs had to have their body armor and their firearms. So I don't know about you, but the person conducting family therapy, having a firearm and body armor sounds a little rough, right? And so it was for me a clear example of, even when you're trying to do, and the person, the chief probation officer implemented this, was totally trying to do the right thing, really good, but showed that even when you're the head of the system, you have a system that can fight back pretty hard. And that's the challenge with even trying to do good within the system.
Yeah. I'm going to answer this one quick question, and then I'm going to throw something back to you, David, that we had talked about earlier. Michael Fitzgerald asked, in the early days of Raise the Age campaign, was there an expectation among supporters that it would result in a reduction of racial disparity among who gets detained? Is it surprising that this has gotten worse, despite Raise the Age of the long-term declines in arrests and detention? So, you know, I think the quick answer to that is the number of young people because of Raise the Age initiatives, and there's been 13 states that have raised the age of their criminal court jurisdiction to 18. There's only 3 states left that set it at 17. So the quick answer to that is the sheer number of children kept out of the adult system has benefit all kids. So that's important to note. The racial disparities remain bad. In New York, we can talk about the fact that they just shouldn't have an AO court to begin with, even though many of those kids are getting returned to family court. They still have, you know, a couple of thousand kids in that adult court, which is way out of whack with the rest of the country. But it goes to the point of where we police young people and the fact that these kids are getting referred to court still formally on things like loitering, possession charges, simple possession charges, willful disobedience, that's my favorite one, and things like that, which they, again, should be formally diverted from. So I'd say that's a quick answer to that question. But what that ties into explicitly that I want to turn back to David about is when we're talking about things like social work and diversion and restorative practice, you've done a lot of work in the space around trying to redefine things as positive youth justice. Can you talk a little bit about how that framework, either one of you, how that framework actually shifts what the role of probation is and this, you know, your nalum tralum.
Yeah. And so, you know, probation kind of became for a long time and was for a long time and still is in some places this trail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em, right? Catch them doing something wrong and lock them back up. The work that I have tried to do with many others and continue to do with several probation departments around the country is this notion of a positive youth development, positive youth justice system, where we don't see young people as bundles of deficits, who we only think about the worst thing they ever did, right? If we think about us and we're judged by the worst thing we ever did, it would be terrible, right? And so, but that's how we treat young people coming into the system, but rather seeing them as they are, which is young people full of assets and strengths, and knowing that if we build on those strengths and assets and serve the needs they have, that they would do much better than just responding to them in a punitive, deficit-based way. And so through that and kind of the reforms under that, we kind of call it the RIR framework of reduce, improve, and reinvest, significantly reduce the size of the system, really improve what's left of the system, and then reinvest the savings from a smaller system back into the community. But that improvement part is really transforming the work of probation. And so what we've my organization proposed formally in LA and San Francisco and a few other places where we have been providing technical assistance is change the role of POs, literally change their position descriptions and change their accountability structure, that their responsibility is to connect young people to community-based services that build on their strength and address their needs, and they're genuinely connected to those services, not just handed a referral. And a lot of times we hear people say, oh yeah, I do that. And I'm like, that's great, but that's not what you're held accountable to, and that's not what your job description says, right? And so that is in terms of shifting to more of a positive youth justice system, but that's after we totally have shrunk it to a smaller size.
Yep.
And Marcy, if I can,
yes, exactly.
I wanted to jump in a little bit just to piggyback on what David's saying, and that's so important in terms of that positive youth justice framework. And so thinking about that specific question that was asked, it's surprising to some the disparities, but I think for many of us it's not. And so just what David's talking about, where you've had the predominant methods and techniques for working with young people in most probation departments, even still, is around risk reduction and purely deficit based. And it just fails to see the whole field in terms of thinking about youth development. So I think the approaches David is talking about is just right. But when these methods became popular in the field and that were solely focused on risk reduction, the common refrain was a rising tide raises all boats. And oftentimes myself, even as a state level policymaker, was asking, how are we addressing disparities? And the usual response was, well, these are good practices. These are race neutral assessment tools, which isn't true. There's bias, implicit bias baked into these tools. But we were told rising tide raises all boats. And that is now proven to not be true because quite frankly, just not recognizing that for youth of color, like these boats may have holes in them or be weighted down. And you don't fix a problem that you don't name. And so I think, and even to the earlier question about what narratives we want to shift, I think that's a narrative that should be challenged. You'll hear juvenile justice leaders throwing around terms like criminogenic need and, recidivism and risk reduction, and all these things are very deficit based and fail to see young people in a holistic way.
And they also don't show how the system actually exacerbates much of the individual, what they would categorize as individual risks, right? So it really is a full 180 from the way we address that now. I want to get to the last question and have this kind of tie into some of the work that I know you guys do, which is being informed by young people who are impacted, right? So Charlotte asks, are there examples of states or counties that are involving youth voices in conversations about how to reform juvenile justice using their experiences to inform policies? And I want to just have you take that a little bit further and say, how are we doing that to also reduce the racial and ethnic disparities that we continue to see? No small task that I threw at you as your last question.
So I think one of the places David just talked about, he made me think of that is Cook County. It has for a long time had a youth advisory council that actually is part of the training and onboarding for new probation officers in Cook County. So I think that's a strong model. One of the jurisdictions I'm working with through the Casey Foundation, Pierce County, in the state of Washington, I think has done really well with that. They have a new approach to probation they call opportunity-based probation that really focuses on using incentives as a primary motivator for their youth on probation. And they, designed that in large part by listening to young people to find out like what incentives are appealing to them and what types of community opportunities they should be creating and what type. So that really helped instruct them on what type of community partners they should be looking for based on the interests, the particular interests of youth in that community. So those are a couple examples. I'm sorry, Marcy, the second part of it, or you want us to take it further?
Well, you're touching on it a little bit because what type of strategies will work to actually reduce the disparities that we're seeing in probation in particular?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that in itself, and we talk about this a lot at Casey, we talk about including youth voice, we talk about family engagement, community partnerships. And what I'm always telling the jurisdictions we work with is these are values, but these are also strategies. And so it's not just about something that feels good for the sake of it feeling good. These are smart tactical decisions to be much more inclusive and to make sure that you have all the right voices around the table because you're just going to be better informed. And part of the job of any probation officer is to do assessments and to do investigations into the family, to understand everything that's going on in the life of the child. But oftentimes we make these types of assessments without really having all the information that we need. And so information from community leaders, from families, other people who make up that young person circle of care, and most importantly, young people is critical to having a well-rounded view and to make the best decisions.
Thanks, Steve. Do you want to add to that, David?
I think that was said well. Just in that the the diversion program I talked about and many others that I'm aware of, one of the key ingredients is having youth voice. When we were at the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services in DC, we added a significant component to how we were developing the plans with work with young people. What's crazy is most probation departments around the country, they create a case plan. There's very little interaction with the youth to determine that plan. And often, even when there is, once the youth is put on probation, it's handed off to a PO who may not even look at the plan and just determine conditions. But in DC, we created what was called a youth family team meeting. And so in determining the plan, the young person, their family, and others sat around the table, and we heard from the young person first on what's the young person's strengths, what's their challenges, what's their needs, and how are we going to develop a plan to address all of those. And so that's answering in terms of the direct work. But to Steve's great point, in terms of making these reforms to the system, it's critical to have the youth voice as a significant part of that.
Thank you, guys. And the only thing I'll add to that, as somebody who's been running a national campaign, is that narrative shift cannot be underscored enough. There is a very significant role for media in addressing the incredible harm that is done to children of color who come in contact with the law. And so I put in the chat an article that one of the John Jay Fellows from last year wrote about kids transferred to adult court in Mississippi. And she did a great job about pulling the historical Jim Crow laws into how we came to be to this place in Mississippi. And I just want to highlight that as an excellent way to really challenge the ongoing narrative. And then the other piece I'm going to say is that in New York City last year, when the young Columbia student was stabbed by minors, the New York Times editorial board actually wrote an incredibly nuanced piece about the fact that those young people deserve to have their identities protected and to be and to remain in the juvenile justice system where they can actually get age appropriate services. And if you compare how they spoke about those young people as children and to what they did in the 1990s with the young men that were charged in the Central Park case, I think you can see what I'm talking about in terms of the very, very important role to shift that narrative. So it takes all of us. Any last minute words from Steve and David, because I think we're about 3 minutes away, or any last questions?
No, nothing for me other than I think where I started, which is question, be skeptical and question and kind of get under the hood. Don't make assumptions about the nature of juvenile probation.
Yep. No, just thank you. Wonderful conversation. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Steve. Love to talk to you all day.
And follow up with a very quick question to the two of you. It's sort of Joe Dominic's question is, what stories are you not seeing that you'd like to see in both of your areas that journalists should do?
So there was a story earlier this year about a young lady in the state of Michigan who was sent to placement as a result of probation violations, and it was largely school issues during this time of COVID, and it was online schooling, and it received some national press. And I think for those of us who have worked in the field and worked close to this, that wasn't a surprising story. That there were stories like that all the time. And so I think we need to cover more of that and talking to young people and families and hearing those stories. Some of the most distressing, emotionally tolling days have been when I've worked in jurisdictions and been able to review records and seeing the files of young people who have been in the system for all of their adolescence. I remember one jurisdiction looking at the file, and this young man was on probation and in and out of detention and placement for violations of probation, and maybe over a 5-year period had been at home 2 months in total, had not spent a birthday through all of his teenage years at home. And this was because of a low-level offense at 12 or 13 and just going through the revolving door of probation. And there's stories like that all across the country that are just heartbreaking, but we need to tell those stories more, and not just on their individual merit, but because they speak to larger structural issues.
David?
And yeah, I would say I could list off a million. I was trying to figure out which of the million examples could I give. You know, the one thing I'll say, which is, again, a bit more complicated, but is this in terms of investments, right? So we think about the system, we think about incarceration, and we think about diversions or alternatives, community. The cents on the dollar that community programs get versus the system is almost itself criminal, right? And then, ironically, some of that money comes from the system, and they say you've got to jump through all these hoops, and you've got to prove you are evidence-based. You know, that's always funny, given that what's the evidence we have on probation is that it's not effective. Yet they continue to get extraordinary amount of money from taxpayers for being ineffective. And so I think that just the everyday program, everyday profile of the incredible work that community-based organizations are doing with young people while getting cents on the dollar investment versus the more harmful and effective approach of a punitive deficit-based probation system. That juxtaposition is, I think, a story I've never really seen, and would be good to see.
That's actually a great segue to our next session, which is going to be about financing juvenile justice change.
There you go. I set it up.
Also, I want to commend an investigation the Milwaukee Journal did recently on a very similar story to the story about Grace, about a young girl, 16-year-old, who died in detention in the Racine, Wisconsin detention facility. It's on the crime report this morning. If you guys want to take a look at it, we'll put a link on the chat line. Michael can do that. But I want to thank both of you for really compelling and absorbing thoughts, and remind our journalists that if they have any extra questions, just bundle them and send them to me or to Joe, and we'll put them to the both speakers and to Marcy as well, and we'll have answers for you on our conference page. So thank you both, and thank you, Marcy, for leading the discussion. We'll take a 5 or 10 minute break, and then we'll go on to our last session of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you.